Aliens are an enduring human obsession.
Spacecrafts could come in by the thousands.
A French journalist and race car driver says he encountered the superior being who taught him to spread the word.
From alternative theories of ancient civilizations to the influence of cultural landmarks, mankind has marveled at the stars and wondered if the seeds of our civilization were sown from those beyond our planet. But what if they are already on their way here? What if we call them here because the death and destruction we have caused have led some to believe that we need new stewards of Earth? What if, despite best efforts, there was no science or technology we could use to overcome them? Could the salvation of the human race lie in the capacity of our greatest weapon? Could human ingenuity be enough to overcome insurmountable odds? And when all is lost in science, could the rules of evolution and behavioral economics be the key to self-preservation? Are they as universal as the very physics that is beyond our reach? These are just some, but not all, of the questions we're going to address in Cixin Liu's The Dark Forest. Let's get into it. Hello everyone and welcome back. I am so excited to finally dig into the meat and potatoes review of The Dark Forest. This review, unlike the one that I did previously, which kind of highlighted some of the things you might want to look out for if you've already read Three Body Problem, that one was spoiler free. This one is 100% going to contain spoilers. Now, I'm not going to go out of my way to spoil specific details or ruin things about this book for you, but in talking about the themes and the general plot and what I love so much about the characters, I am going to give away a little bit of what happens. I'm going to spare you the details of the very end. There are certain aspects that happen that I'm not going to go into, but in picking apart what I love so much about this book and what this book does so well, I will be giving a few things away, so keep that in mind. So where did we leave off in the Three Body Problem? We know that the Trisolarans are coming to Earth, and we have to do something to stop them, unless you're part of the ETO, in which case you have to do something to make sure that they come here so that they can do their job and take over the world for us. And that is the crux of the second book. Instead of doing something like the Three Body Problem, we have something called the Wallfacer Project. So if you recall, the Sophons that the Trisolarans sent to Earth created a block that prevented scientific progress from happening for the human civilization. It had halted all kind of quantum mechanics and stuff like that that might give humans a leg up on the Trisolarans. So we were stuck with what we had, the science that we already had developed at the time. Now, it turns out that that didn't impede us from doing some incredible things, and we're going to get to that later on. But one of the things that the Sophons could not do was look inside the human mind. As such, the world launched the Wallfacer Project, and the Wallfacer Project designated 4 individuals to basically come up with a plan to protect the Earth or defeat the Trisolarans, but not tell anybody about it. Wallfacers have unlimited resources essentially at their disposal to execute these plans, and they are not supposed to tell them to anybody, which might sound absurd, but when it's a last-ditch effort for the survival of the human civilization, then you gotta do what you gotta do. I mentioned that we assigned 4 Wallfacers. The first one is Frederick Taylor. He is a former military officer, I think Secretary of Defense for the United States. Comes up, I won't go into details about his plan, but has a very kind of standard military approach to it. Then we have Manuel Ray Diaz, who is the former president of Venezuela, and he comes up with a plan that I could best describe as basically, if we can't have Earth, then nobody can. And now he has some pretty interesting ways on how he goes about that and how he gets out of being condemned by the world for the kind of plan that he has. I won't get into how that plays out, although it does play into more than just Manuel Ray Diaz, which again, I really appreciated. We have Bill Hines, who takes a very different kind of psychological approach, knowing that morale in the human civilization is probably going to fall. It might be the best thing to implant or instill some sense of confidence for the human race so that we can at least push forward and not defeat ourselves and have that defeatism prior to even having the chance to defend ourselves against the Trisolarans. And then we have Luo Ji, who casts a spell at a star. Now, Luo Ji is probably what you would consider the main character of this. If Wen Jie was the main character in the first book, Luo Ji is definitely kind of the central figure that we spend probably the most time with. But just as in the first book, there are many characters that play a pivotal role in this. So it's not just Luo Ji that we're following around. However, we do spend a lot of time with it. Now, speaking of Ji, he is the character that pops up right in the beginning of this book. Now, in the previous video that I made about the Dark Forest, I had mentioned that there was some marginal marginal crossover in characters between the first and second book. Not much, but a little. And one of those crossovers happens right in the beginning, where Wenjie is at a cemetery and runs into Luo Ji and imparts upon him the 2 rules of space civilization. Rule number 1 of space civilization is that all civilizations, their primary goal is survival. Rule number 2 is that all civilizations expand, however, there are a finite amount of resources in the universe. Those are the only 2 rules. Now, if you're like me, you probably read this and maybe put it in the back of your mind or forgot it completely throughout the rest of the book, despite how important it is to understand these concepts towards the end. And we're going to talk a lot about those concepts and relay them to other economic, behavioral economic concepts, evolutionary psychology concepts, game theory, all kinds of stuff that Cixin Liu really layers into this book that makes it just an astonishing collection of ideas to wrestle with. Now, the most interesting thing about Luo Ji is that he is the only wall-facer who really doesn't want much to do with the wall-facer project, and yet he seems to be the only wall-facer that the Trisolarans actually consider a threat. In fact, Ji kind of detaches himself from society. When he gets the responsibility to become a wall-facer, instead of diving headfirst into the task like all the other wall-facers do, he kind of goes off in seclusion and really just focuses on himself. And this individualistic kind of approach, this selfish approach, I should say, runs in stark contrast to who I would argue is the other closest thing to a main character, and we'll get to him shortly. One of the people that he disappears kind of in seclusion to is a woman who is the quote-unquote kind of woman of his dreams. And the inception of this is pretty interesting because one of my favorite scenes in this book kind of was the start of what led to him trying to find this woman and kind of exclude himself from the whole crisis to begin with. There is a point in the book where he's talking to somebody who gets him to kind of go through an exercise to understand the power of his imagination, and that he is able to almost bring to life in a visceral way a woman that he imagines in his mind, such that he goes through an entire drive in the countryside with this woman, and it feels so visceral, so real to him that it is almost indistinguishable from what's happening in real life. And he seems so drawn to fulfilling that once he gets the resources at his disposal to do so, that's all he's really interested in. Now, I might have lost something with the relevance of this scene outside of just his capacity to problem solve the Trisolaran crisis, but I found the scene where he envisions that person very interesting. It was borderline Murakami-esque and the almost surreal way that he went about it. If there's more relevance to this scene that I'm missing, please let me know. Now, a little note on pacing here. A lot of people told me that in the 3-body problem, they had a little bit of issue with the pacing, particularly when it came to the tedium of discovering what the 3-body problem was. And I found that happened a lot to me in this book as well, which, again, this is a phenomenal book, but there were a lot of vignettes, a lot of characters that had these side scenes that I didn't really think were necessary. And I wonder if this is almost second book syndrome. And I don't mean second book syndrome as in this book just exists to bring us from the introduction of the conflict to the grand climax in the 3rd book. But I mean more of when a first book is released in a series, typically it tends to be more tightly edited. It's pared down so that the page count isn't so long. And then once that proof of concept kind of bears out in the market, they let the author breathe a little bit more and expand and kind of play around a little bit more with the form in their second book. There were just scenes like there were these old men that were kind of just talking about what was happening at the time, and maybe that just helped develop the world and what was going on. There's a scene where Dashi's son goes to prison, and it's like a page for no particular reason that doesn't really play into the book. I should also mention that that's the other character that carries on from book 1 to book 2 was Dashi, and I was really excited about that too, because he's definitely one of my favorite characters in the first one. And speaking of Dashi, I was hoping Dashi was going to be Luo Ji's Wallbreaker in a way. Now, I haven't mentioned Wallbreakers yet. The Wall Facers are responsible for kind of dreaming up these plans against the Trisolarans, but the Trisolarans need something to combat those plans. So the ETO from book number 1, I believe standing for the Earth Trisolaran Organization, they assign Wall Breakers, which badass name for an association, by the way. The responsibility of the Wall Breakers is to uncover the plan of the Wall Facers and publish those such that the Trisolarans can now understand the plan and account for it when they do arrive. And a lot of the fun of this book comes from almost the unreliable narrator angle from each one of these wall facers as we try to discover what exactly it is that they're planning based off of their actions, and then seeing exactly how the wall breakers uncover their plans, whether they do or not. Now, speaking of some of these kind of asides and these little vignettes that didn't directly relate to the Wallfacer project, one of those ends up becoming much more important than I initially gave it credit for, and that was the arc of Zhang Behai. Zhang Behai is an officer in the army, and he is a triumphalist who is dead set on winning the war against the Trisolarans, or at least the survival of the human race. He goes so far as to berate his colleagues regarding their defeatism, and says that defeatism is one of the biggest threats that come to that plague the human race. This plays in huge in the timeline of this book, because this book actually takes place in 2 different times. One of those times is 200 years in the future, following an event called the Great Ravine that purges a lot of the human population and forces maybe not forces, but causes the humans to take their civilization underground. It is the character arc across that span of time where Zhang Behai really comes through in the book as one of the pivotal characters that we see, and I find him to be the direct opposition of Luoji. While Luoji represents the individualist mindset, he doesn't want anything to do with this. He just wants to focus on his own work. He's not really concerned with being the savior of the human race. Zhang Behai is the opposite. Not that he wants to be the savior of the human race, and not even that he's necessarily a collectivist, but he is a duty-bound soldier. He is a triumphalist, and he sees himself as nothing more than a set piece in the victory of the human race. He will do what needs to be done according to what he was ordered to do. And when I mentioned before that there was still a fairly strong cultural thread that wove its way through this book, I think it wove its way through Zhang Behai particularly, because he takes the mentality of the society that he grew up in, and he takes it directly into the future. Now, what does this future look like? The future following the Great Ravine looks drastically different. Again, society has now gone underground, where they have built their cities there because it is more protected against any conflict that's going to happen on the surface. That doesn't mean people don't live on the surface, it's just not as common. Throughout that time, there was vast developments in science. Maybe not any new science, but there's a decoupling between the science that we know and the technology that we can develop from that science. A lot of the time, the science is ahead of the technology, and we have to learn the best ways to utilize that science for the betterment of humankind or for the market, what have you. And it turns out everything from energy production to growing food to space travel, there was a ton of stuff that had not yet been tapped by the potential of the human species, and humans had used that to drastically change their lifestyle and also create several space forces that now serve as kind of autonomous nations in space. Now, the key aspect here is really, and there's no way not to spoil this, uncovering Heinz's real motivations behind his kind of implanting ideas into people's heads. It turns out that he truly wished to implant the idea of defeatism within people's minds. It kind of aligned with his ideology at the time. And when Zhang Behai wakes up after hibernation in the future, they assign him a pivotal role in the military simply because he's the only one who can be trusted, because he's the only soldier in the army who was around before that technology was around. And otherwise, they can't really trust that anyone around them doesn't have that imprint of defeatism in their mind. They could just be putting on a mask and pretending to be part of the army and be a front for triumphalism until they turn their back on the human race at the last second. So they give a lot more power to Zhang Behai based on the trust that they believe that he can have. And it turns out in the end that it has nothing to do with defeatism and everything to do with his cultural upbringing that causes Behai to essentially defect for the sake of the human race, not in opposition to it. And this divide, right, really comes through in the hubris of the human species after the Great Hibernation, after the Great Ravine, I should say. At this point, humans are completely confident that they're going to win against the Trisolarans. Of course they are. Look at everything they've developed. Look at what they've done with their society. Look at what they've done with their space forces. There's an immense amount of confidence, and Zhang Behai knows better. He has lived through times that have taught him otherwise from a military perspective, and he even says things like, people in this age follow orders because it's the right thing to do, or they think it's the right path, or something along these lines. And while Zhang Beihai himself follows orders because he follows orders, he's a soldier and he does what he ought to do, not what he thinks should be done in the moment. And that really carries him through, and it has massive implications for basically the human civilization, particularly the civilization in space. And I love this juxtaposition against Luo Ji. We have drastically different outcomes with equally severe consequences on both Luo Ji's side and Zhang Beihai's side. Zhang Beihai is both the hero and the traitor, and Luo Ji is both the selfish and the savior. And it's a tired trope, but I do have a soft spot for the self-destructive anti-hero. So although Zhang Beihai, the turning point of his character arc was really appealing to me and done excellent, something about Luo Ji really had me rooting for him, particularly when a character loses it and comes back and redeems themselves. And the way that he used another wall facer's approach in certain scenes in the book. If you know when he's talking at the end to the sky, we'll say, you'll know what I'm talking about. And earlier when I talked about a fifth wall facer, that would arguably be Zhang Beihai, precisely because he was the only one who seemed to be able to hide his motives sufficiently to actually have an impact for the human race. Okay, but let's go back. Why did Luo Ji send a spell to a planet, or to a star, I should say? It turns out in the future, that star explodes. Now, you read that at first and you're like, was he able to cause a star to explode by sending a spell out to a star? Obviously not. However, this is where I forgot the first scene of the book, those 2 rules of space civilization. Now, again, the 2 rules of space civilization are 1, all civilizations' primary goal is survival, and number 2, all civilizations expand, although there are a finite amount of resources in the universe. This is where we're going to get into technical stuff, because this reminds me of 2 concepts. The first is kind of a game theory idea known as the prisoner's dilemma, and there's probably other game theoretical scenarios that capture this better. I'm going to lay out the prisoner's dilemma here in a very basic example. The other one is signal detection theory, and then we're going to talk about Fermi's paradox and what I perceive to be the Dark Forest. So when Luo Ji sends that out, he knows that when other civilizations see that there is any signal that there might be intelligent life out there, it will be destroyed instantly. Now, why is that? It is because when you cannot trust another actor, even though it might be mutually beneficial for you to cooperate, it is in your best interest to not cooperate for the better outcome on your behalf. The higher the stakes are, the higher and the worse the consequences are for you, the more you are incentivized to work on your own behalf. So in the prisoner's dilemma, we can plot this on kind of economic version of a Punnett square. So we got 4 squares. So let's say 2 people are caught committing a crime and they're working together. They sit these criminals down in separate rooms and they give them a choice. You can either rat on the other person or you can't. Now, if both people stay silent, let's say they will each get 2 years in prison. If one person rats on the other person, so if I say to you, if you rat on the other person, you'll only get 1 year in prison, but they'll get 9. But if both of you rat on each other, you will both get 4 years in prison. So for the total outcome of the group, the best option is for you to both stay silent. But for your best interest, you should rat on the other person because you're going to get less time. And who cares if they get more time? Now, if this is an isolated incident, it is always better to act in your best interest. However, the more times you play this game, the more it changes, and the more trust you can establish with somebody else, the more you're likely to both stay silent. However, trust is a factor of connection, which is often a factor of proximity. You will likely trust people in your household more than you will another household, more than you will somebody else in your city, more than you will somebody else in a different state or province, more than you will from a different country, etc., etc., etc. So when somebody is part of a completely different planetary system, there is no way to establish that trust. The only option for survival is to act in your own self-interest. And if you can destroy that other threat, that's the best way to maintain your survival, which again is rule number 1 of space civilizations. This also brings up the idea of signal detection theory. Okay, now signal detection theory basically talks about the relationship between a signal that you get from the environment and the response that you have to that signal. A very common way to describe this is usually through some sort of diagnostic testing. Let's take a very relevant example over the past 2 years, if you know what I'm talking about. If you have an infectious disease and you take a test and it is positive, that is a hit or a true positive. If you don't have that infectious disease and the test reads negative, that's a true negative. If you have the disease and the test reads negative, that's a false negative, which is a big issue. And if you don't have the disease, but the test reads positive, that's also a huge issue because that's known as a false positive and can lead people into very poor decision making. Now, in isolation, this is kind of pretty simple, but the first rule of space civilization is an evolutionary framework. In evolution, the fittest species, and I don't mean fitness in terms of, how fast they are, what their cardio is like. Fitness talks specifically in an evolutionary context about the ability to pass on your genes to the next civilization. Survival is the most important insofar as it allows you to pass your genes on to the next civilization. The easier you can do that with the least amount of energy expelled, the more efficient of a species you are. So let's put this into an evolutionary framework. Let's say you're a rabbit and you're in a grassy field, okay? You hear a rustling in the grass. Now, if that rustling is a fox about to eat you and you run, that is a hit. That is a positive. Now, if you hear a rustling in the grass and you run and it's just the wind, that's a false positive. You will expend the energy necessary to run, even though that is very expensive for you to do. We take for granted as a human civilization with an abundance of food that it's very easy for us to get calories. But for a lot of animals, that's not so easy. So you don't want to run, you don't want to fight, you don't want to expend all these calories and energy if you don't have to. However, if the consequence of a positive detection is so great that it risks your entire life, you will expend the energy through a range of false positives just to maintain your survival. And that is exactly what Cixin Liu outlines in this kind of scenario, in this game theoretical framework that he lines out in the Dark Forest. And this is also Cixin Liu's explanation for the Fermi paradox. And the Fermi paradox basically says that given all our calculations for how much life there should be in the universe, how come we can't find any of it? Because the second you detect life elsewhere, it is more prudent for you to eliminate that life than risk the entire fall of your civilization and species to attempt to cooperate with an actor that you cannot trust. This is what Cixin Liu refers to as the Dark Forest. Now, I will admit, given the whole Wallfacer project setup and the fact that Trisolarans can't read, they don't understand deceit, and the Sophons couldn't read people's mind, I initially thought the Dark Forest was a metaphor for the human brain. And that's probably because of my background, my educational background. Again, I have a strong psych background and neuroscience background, so if you know what a neuron looks like, or if you've seen a neuron in a textbook, it probably looks something like this. But the way that they're organized cortically in your brain looks a little bit more like this. And as soon as we got to the post-Great Ravine era, where all the cities were built underground, they were also built in ways that really reminded me of the way neurons are organized in the cortex. The cities were built with these massive concrete pillars that went up and down to hold up the caverns that the cities were built within. And then there were branches that stuck out. And from those branches, buildings were built out of them, almost like leaves or dendritic spines if it was a neuron, where people would actually live. And then it turned out that the Dark Forest was part of the metaphor for why space is so quiet. Whether Cixin Liu intended for this to happen or not, I don't think is relevant. I don't think authorial intent really matters here. The fact that I was able to draw all of those connections just from what he laid out in the book, whether consciously done or not, was also just a phenomenal layer of symbolism that I saw throughout the Dark Forest. So yeah, what else is there to say from such a phenomenal book? I can't remember. Again, I mentioned that in the three-body problem, I liked it a little bit better because of how it was set up. That takes nothing away from the brilliance of the Dark Forest. We have behavioral economics, we have game theory, we have Fermi paradox, we have all sorts of physics aspects, we have the hubris of the human race, we have the juxtaposition between diametrically opposed characters, we have evolutionary psychology. There's so much conceptually wrapped up in this book for you to chew on. It's so rich, it is so well laid out, that I truly appreciate the genius that it takes to craft a book like this. And I absolutely can't wait to see how Cixin Liu wraps this up in Death's End. The title alone has me asking so many questions. I've also heard it's the headiest one of the bunch. Again, I mentioned this in the last video I did, but I picked up the audiobook, I started listening to it, and I knew right away that I need to pick up the physical copy. I'm probably going to start that in March. Let me know how you think it fits into the series. Let me know how you think it relates to book 1 versus book 2, because book 2 was so drastically different from the first book that I can only imagine that he must tackle just the craziest stuff in the third book. So let me know how you liked it compared to the other two, how it fits in the series in general. Please no spoilers, because uncovering so many of the concepts is really the joy of Cixin Liu's books. And yeah, I love this book. Probably one of the most impressive books I've ever read, and also accessible. Maybe accessible if you have a little bit more of an inclination towards science type concepts. In the past, I've struggled with highly historically dense and literary stuff. But yeah, let me know how you like this one, guys, and I will catch you guys on the next video. Os.